Hi, I'm Vida Clucky with Vida's Collectibles. Join me in my studio today while I show you how to paint pine cones my way. There's an example of what I'll be doing using 3 values, and I will show you the colors and the brushes that I'm going to be using. This is the 3 pine cone composition that I'll be working on today. I redrew that slightly larger on a round tile. Of course, I had to mark the top because this has hanging holes, so I have to know that this is the top. So I laid these out with the 3 pine cones and some pine needles and a little bit of branch. The colors I'll be using today are yellow brown, a reddish red brown. It's my brandy shadow, which is a very dark brown. And 3 shades of green, like a light moss, could be a chartreuse, antique or brown green, darkest green. I grind all my dry China paint colors with mineral oil, which keeps them open. I paint with my semi-open medium oil. And then for solvent cleaner, I like to use odorless mineral spirits, and this happens to be Terpenoid Natural. If I want a real deep cut right down to the white china, I will use my odorless mineral spirits. For a soft wipeout, I will use the Terpenoid Natural. My brushes I use are the Aquaflow square shaders. These are really nice, especially on forms like this with the sharp edges. They hold a nice firm square flat edge. And then I will be using a scroller brush for branches and the pine needles. Okay, so let's get started. I like to first lay in with the medium brown, thinned with a small bit of thinner. I'll lay a few branches in with my scroller. Because these are behind the pine cones, and so I want the pine cones to lay on top of these branches. So I'm just going to roughly lay those in. I try to make them look rather barky. I will take a small square shader, tap a little highlight in there. Just so I know what direction I'm going here. Also, I'll rinse that brush out a little bit. I'm going to lay in a few of my branches. Onto my branches, I'm going to lay in a few needles because they're going to be under the pine cone. So I'm just going to mix my light medium value together and thin it just slightly with a little of my odorless terp, just so I get a little loose paint here that doesn't pull so hard when I pull out my branches or my needles. So let's get a few of those laid in behind. Now all these needles come from that stem, so they have to cross over and pull out from somewhere on that stem. Now this is first fire, so I'm not going to go into my darkest value quite yet. So I may have to thin this just a little bit more, so I'll pull some out, cross a few over. Now that's probably a little thick. I might let that dry, and then I would go back and wipe out some highlights. I like to extend some of this over the edge if you'll notice, I'm going to do that here and here so that this is attached in at least 3 places. That makes for a good composition. If you can attach your subject in some way, otherwise it tends to look like it's floating. Alright, so I'm going to cross a few of these over, make some longer, some shorter. I don't want these to look like a little bristle brush. See, this is just barely touching here, so that's probably all I'll do for today on that. I'm going to bring a few little sprigs out here. So we're going to prepare this background so that we can lay the pine cones over top. We could do it the other way. You could do your pine cones completely and do a fire and come back and do this background in a second fire if it's easier for you. Now it's good too if we can layer some of these over the branch, because that makes for good composition. Anytime you can layer. Let's put a little bit of a branch in here. Let's get a little branch going here. The wonderful part about porcelain painting is it's not on permanent until it's fired, so I can change my mind about any of this later. One can really fuss with pine cones, and just like with roses or anything else, I think getting in and getting out works best. You get a looser look to your pine cones. So let's just get this laid in quickly here so we can go on. Alright, so I have the 3 pine cones here. This cone is underneath. It's further back, so I'm going to want to paint that one in first. And then I'm going to want to go to pine cone number 2 and then pine cone number 3. So I'm just going to condition my brush with my painting medium, but I always push that oil off. I just use that oil to condition my brush, not to paint with. So I have found it easier. I'm going to go into my lightest value, which is yellow-brown. I find it easier to block in the local color, which would be what the pine cone is mostly colored as the light value here. So we'll pop that in, and I want to take this shape, give it an interesting outer edge as I can, because that's one of the prominent characteristics of a pine cone is its sharp triangular edges. So I'll just lightly soften that down. I'm going to go into my medium value now, which is my red-brown, and pull that color, get a nice smooth load. And if my light source is coming from, usually this way, 11 o'clock, let's just put a little arrow in there, because when you keep turning things, you tend to forget which way your light source is coming from. So let's start blocking in on the shadow side. This third value. And I'll soften that. And now, without any color on my brush, I'll just feather that out. And already I'm starting to get a little bit of form going on there, because I've got the lighter value, the medium value. Now I'm going to go into the brandy shadow, which is the darkest of my values, and I'm going to lay it very strong right in where it separates between the other pine cones. I want to make sure that there's good separation there. And I'm going to pull some side needles out, soften those, and then the inner part of the pine cone, these tiny little fibers, they look like little wood pieces that come out in there from that center. So now I've oiled and conditioned my brush again. I'm going to do a feather stroke, hold my brush back here, and finally merge those colors. All right, from a distance, we're seeing a little bit of a form there. I will drop to the smaller brush now and condition that. Let's take our wipeout tool and firm up a few of these edges before we go finishing that. The scales. Let's make sure we have a very interesting outer edge. If I don't feel like it's strong enough, I can always go back and do some reshaping. If I feel like this edge might need a little bit more interesting edge, and maybe make sure that that edge is nice and square. Okay, we are ready to do some cutting. So I'm going to clean this with oil, do a soft wipeout. I like to start at the bottom and pull and pull. Now these alternate like bricks. So if I put one there, maybe I'll put one here, one here. They don't have to be exact. They should alternate somewhat. And they're a little larger at the bottom, and as they come up to the top, they get a little smaller, a little tighter, just almost like a rose. You see, I'm not really fussing too awfully much with these. I think they look better when you get in and you get out. I'll put some interesting little center in there and wipe that back. Now, I'm going to pay a little bit more attention. I'm going to turn it this way and put a little point on a few of these. Because they do form a little triangular edge that comes out. And I don't have to do them all. And I might not even do too much over here on the shadow side. I'm thinking, being that's the one in the back, I might just leave it alone. I think the body of it looks good. If I need to add more green in back here for the pine needles, I can still do that later. So let's go on to pine cone number 2. Again, I have a little bit of dark brown on here, so I'm going to want to maybe put that in my Turpenoid Natural and get some of that color out of there. Let's go into our lightest value again, yellow-brown, pull, 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 and block that in. This is just a shape. We're trying to give it form. And we do that by using values. This is just going to be a wash of local color. Soften that. Again, now I will go to my medium value, reddish brown, And I want to pop that in against this main pine cone that's in front and bring some of it up. Lightly wash it around. This one can be a little lighter than the one behind it. Okay, darkest value, Brandy Shadow. Wiggle that brush around, get a nice load. Comma stroke that Brandy Shadow up into that. Nestle it up against the next pine cone in front of it to create depth so that the viewer knows immediately that that pine cone is behind. Let's darken the center, maybe not quite that much. This Brandy Shadow is a pretty strong color. Again, I will take my brush from the back and soften, feather that out somewhat. Let's check those edges. Nice, sharp, irregular edges if you can do that with your chisel end of your wipeout tool. Clean that up a little bit. Okay, do I need to loosen those edges a little bit? Starting to look round already. Now back to the smaller brush, same thing. We'll do a soft, clean, oiled wipeout. Start at the bottom. We'll find a scale and pull it out. Second fire, we can darken in between the scales. We can push the scales back. And these are rounding themselves around. I may have to twist my brush a little bit. They don't have to be perfect. It's not a photograph, it's a painting. If you have your wipeout pad right next to you, I don't even look at it. I stay focused on what I'm painting, so I keep that pad anchored with my tile so that I can just continue on. Otherwise, I'm glancing back at my painting and wondering where I left off. So if you can keep this anchored and keep it right beside you, if you're right-handed, keep it on your right side. All those little things really help. All right, I'm coming up to the top. They're getting smaller, smaller. Just like the center of the rose. Now let's put in those little filaments. Maybe I'll take just a little darker. Get that pumped up now. All right, now I want to look at this a little closer. Let's go in with a very clean brush and push out a few points, especially where it goes over top of the other pine cone. Get it coming to a point. And they don't all look the same, and they're not supposed to. Now I could give this side a little more highlight. I think I need a little more color right up in here to loosen that edge a little bit. You see, I really need to keep a sharp edge on that brush. Now let's look at where it meets here. I might take my wipeout tool and make a few strong scales that I will wash back in another fire, so they won't be quite this white, but I just want the viewer to know that this one is on top. And then I would come back with a darker shadow color on the inside of this first pine cone in the next fire. So we won't worry about that today. Okay, we're on to the final pine cone. Again, we'll do yellow brown wash. There's my light source. I try to watch my edges a little bit when I do this, but I do end up going back and cleaning them up. Now this is where it's nice to have some of your pine needles in, because you're starting to get that layered look in your composition. All right, I'm going to soften that. Yellow brown, again, red brown for medium value. And I might pull that all the way over here and I'm going to try to use a little less of my brandy shadow, my darkest brown. I'm going to go in with a little less brandy shadow this time, because this pine cone is on top. I want to keep it lighter. If I end up too light, I can always wash it with another color in the next fire. So I'm going to pop that in the center. Let's check our edges with our wipeout tool. Clean back a few innies, and so we can pull out a few outies, and we should be ready to wipe out. So I'm going to go to my smaller brush again, oil, clean, and dry, and start pulling the scales, trying to alternate. Some are going to be bigger and some smaller. If they're all the same, it makes for a very boring composition. So sometimes we have to work at things our mind wants to make everything the same. So we have to loosen up a little bit and try not to make everything look so perfect. Getting a little smaller now as we're approaching the top. I'm going to push out a few highlights too over the top of the one behind it. I want lightest light against darkest dark, because this will probably be my focal area. So if I make sure I keep this nice and white, I'll have my lightest against my darkest. Again, I'm going to push out a few little centers, little triangular edges if I can get them with my brush. I might go back on a few and push them out with my wipeout tool. We'll see. And they don't all have to have points. Now I'm just using an oil clean brush. When I get to the top, I'm going to put my brush in the odorless thinner and push out a deeper highlight, a cleaner highlight. But I don't want that right away. I want to build my way up to it. Okay, now let's try a little of the odorless mineral spirits. Make sure it's good and dry on your brush or your paint will run all over. I want a little more highlight here, a little lighter up against that other pine cone, so the viewer knows that this one is also on top. If I need to form any more tips, I'll do that now. If I don't, they'll be gone forever. Of course, you know that if you lose your highlights on a first fire, you're never going to get them back again. So it's better to err on the lighter side first fire. Now I'm looking at this and maybe a little out around right here. Might have gotten a little high with that edge, so yeah, I'll bring that down a little bit. There, I think I'm happier with that. And now I need to look at this. Let's get rid of some of this excess stuff that's going on here and see what we have. Get rid of our light source line. We can see what's really going on here. I might go with the super cleaned terped dried brush and hit a couple highlights on the light side. So I don't lose those lights. I think I'm okay here. And then make sure I'm satisfied with the outer shape of this one. Now I'm getting to the point where I'm getting a little picky and playing too much, so that part, it's time to quit with that. Let's look back here now. Let's look at our pine needles. I do like to, on first fire, come back with a few of these and bring them over. You have to do this on first fire. And I might bring a few of these sprigs of needles. It's easier if I can pull it towards me. This gives your composition more depth when you can layer. I might just run this little branch right out and give it some attachment here. And push that other pine cone back a tiny bit. Now I can finish putting more of these on next fire. I'm also going to take a fine wipeout tool. That's a little bit finer of a point. and cut out a few highlights. On the pine needles. I think that is all I would do for this fire. Now I would fire this at 017, maybe even 018 if you have trouble with your reddish browns firing out. And we'll finish the piece after this. Thank you for joining me at Vida's Collectibles Studio on my first firing of the Pinecones. Stay tuned for my second firing in a second video. Please subscribe and also hit the bell button for notifications on my upcoming videos so that you don't miss any.